Hey there, and thanks for listening to Close Read. I'm really excited to share this episode because this is an argument and a form of argument in politics that I often reference a lot, especially because so much of political argumentation involves people talking past one another. That's the concept of a bad faith argument. But first, just wanted to thank folks who have signed up for the Patreon already. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the ideas about topics to tackle. And I've already got some interviews lined up for some subsequent podcasts, so I'm excited to share some perspectives that aren't mine, also perspectives on ethics in political communication, as well as how to fight scientific censorship, another topic that's really near and dear to me. So bad faith arguments are really important to understand because they are so prevalent in political discourse and how politicians avoid actually addressing one another's points and instead, construct straw man arguments that they can go beat up instead. And the example I want to use is a live one. You might remember this recently. This is from the DC statehood debate that the House of Representatives recently had. And they went ahead and approved DC statehood. That was a huge historic win for the DC statehood movement. And the debate was interesting because the debate over DC statehood is remarkably mature. The sides are dug in with their arguments. They've finally honed these arguments over time. And they're interesting arguments because they get to really fundamental stuff about democracy and equal representation under law. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the debate, set the groundwork, and then I want to introduce some of the arguments that Representative Andy Harris, a Republican from Maryland, introduced in opposition to DC statehood. And I want to break down those arguments, talk a little bit substantively about why they're bad faith arguments, but then importantly get to how those bad faith arguments work and the function that they serve for the people who are opposed to this legislation and the function that they serve for their audiences, right? And that's really important to understand. Bad faith arguments let somebody avoid having the core argument that somebody else wants to have who is making a proposal. There are ways to delay, there are ways to distract, there are ways to kick the can down the road and to put responsibility back on the person who's proposing a thing to go ahead and propose something different or satisfy some other demands that you're putting out there. So it's a great way to gum up the works. That's what a lot of these arguments do. And if one is committed to not having the works get gummed up, it's important to not get distracted and flummoxed by bad faith arguments. And that means we got to understand how they work and the purpose they serve so we can transcend them. All right, so DC statehood. DC statehood debate is super mature. There's been a DC statehood movement for decades. People have been arguing for some kind of federal representation for the actual people who live in DC since the 1800s. And that's largely because, the founders in their infinite big brain genius, when they created Washington, DC, they didn't really anticipate that it would have a full-time population, right? The city, Charles Dickens called it a city of magnificent intentions when he visited it. It took a long time to actually come together as a city, and the founders had no idea it was going to become this major metro area with 700,000 people, right? So DC's got more people than Wyoming and Vermont, but it has one member of Congress who doesn't have full voting rights in the House, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and it has no fully fledged senators, right? It does not have statehood level representation. So it's a flaw in the Constitution. It's a quirk, whatever you want to call it. Congress mandated that this area would be the capital. It took some land from Virginia and Maryland. Congress eventually gave some of that land back to Virginia, which we'll get to later. But here you go. There's 700,000 people. What do you do with them? Do you give them equal representation under law? And so far, the answer has been no. Several years ago, after the last census, there was a chance that DC could have gotten a full congressional seat. There was an effort to pass a bill that would have given a new congressional seat to Utah, which was very likely to go to a Republican, and a seat for DC, a full seat for DC, which is very likely to go to a Democrat. But that deal sank, and it sank for reasons that weren't totally related to statehood. The National Rifle Association got involved because they saw an opportunity to condition DC statehood on making the city change its gun laws. And so that deal fell through. But honestly, that deal might have been on shakier constitutional grounds than what we're looking at now, which is full-fledged DC statehood. It's perhaps constitutionally harder to argue for one representative and 0 senators than it is to argue for full statehood with 2 senators and representatives, that match your population. So since then, the statehood movement's gotten even stronger. The name of DC, if it became a state, would be Douglas Commonwealth after Frederick Douglass. So we would keep that DC abbreviation. So no need to, update all the postal addresses. No need to update, all the Amazon.com shipping orders that go through. Right, make it easy for everybody. And the way it would work is that DC itself would become a state, and then within DC, the federal core, from the Potomac River through to the National Mall, the big marble buildings where almost nobody actually lives, and we'll get to that later, that would become the federal core. So that would be the federal district. And so easy peasy, right? We have states that border each other all the time. You would have this nice little federal district nestled between Virginia and the Potomac River on one side, and then DC on the other side. It would have almost no disruption to people's lives right now. If you live in D.C., you're very used to just crossing into Virginia and Maryland all the time. There's houses across the street from each other, and it's like, yeah, you're in Maryland, I'm in the district. We're practically in the same neighborhood, right? And importantly, DC adopted a state constitution in 2016. It was approved by ballot initiative. 86% of voters said, heck yeah, let's become a state. So pretty overwhelming support here locally, self-determined for DC statehood. What happens if DC becomes a state? To all of our current representatives, the mayor would become the governor, and our city council would become a unicameral state legislature, meaning it would just have one house as opposed to a house and a senate. And that would mean that it would join Nebraska as being the only other state with a unicameral legislature, which honestly I think is cleaner and simpler than having two houses, but that is an aside. So the arguments for DC statehood are pretty clear. Everybody deserves equal representation under law. Those of us who live in D.C., we actually suffer for this lack of statehood. The recent COVID relief bills classified D.C. as a territory, which means we got less resources per population than other parts of the country. Those distinctions probably shouldn't exist anyway. If you live in the United States, you live in the United States. We've also got folks in Puerto Rico and other territories and other insular areas that do not have full representation in Congress, and they should eventually have full representation too, although, of course, the deal right now is D.C. statehood. Also, just as a quick aside, a lot of people tend to conflate D.C. statehood and statehood for Puerto Rico. The statehood movement in Puerto Rico, there's also an independence movement in Puerto Rico, so the public mandate there for statehood is not as clear as it is in D.C. It might be in the future. They've had some ballot initiatives. They've had parties say that we're not going to participate in a ballot initiative. So I would say this democratic value of self-determination is not as clear in Puerto Rico as it is in D.C. And I say that as an aside, and if you have folks who are more familiar with politics in Puerto Rico, they'll tell you, please stop imposing your model of yay more states and yay more Democratic senators or whatever on us here. We have a different, much more colonial relationship with the United States, and you got to respect that. So I respect it. Okay, so what are the actual arguments against DC statehood? I would argue that the core argument against DC statehood is purely political. And I mean that in like the absolute rawest Republicans versus Democrats sense of thing. It's purely partisan. There's no parties in the Constitution, right? This was another fun flaw from the founders. They did not anticipate the rise and use of political parties in the United States fully when they wrote the Constitution. So we have this party system that's glommed onto it. Republicans don't think that they can be competitive in D.C. It is a largely liberal, plurality black, 100% urban area. And if it became a state, it would be unique in that regard. Now, could you run some Republican candidates that appeal to folks here? Yeah, sure. They wouldn't look like Republican candidates in other areas, but there's a Republican governor in Maryland, got Republican governors in a lot of blue states. So is it possible? Sure. Would they be like the Republican senators we have now? Maybe not. But I think that is maybe a little failure of imagination. But more importantly, the way that your neighbors vote shouldn't affect how the parties look at you, right? That's another weird flaw in our system. And this crops up in like the red state, blue state divide. They're not quite like that. They're a lot more purpley than we think. And there's Democrats in red states, and there's Republicans in blue states, and yada, yada. But this is important for a political deal, because when we look at states that have been previously admitted to the Union, the last two were Alaska and Hawaii. And at the time, that was not quite a bipartisan deal, but the incentives at least ran in that direction. So it's not like there's a movement to create a new South Utah separate from North Utah, and you could like pair them up with DC. We sort of tried that with that weird deal around adding a representative. That's not really on the table now, just because there's not like another state that wants to like hang out and join the union to balance it out. So the direct argument against DC statehood is really like, F you, I don't like it. I don't want more people to have equal representation if they're likely to vote for Democratic representatives. And I don't feel like coming up with, a Republican platform for a senator who could win office in a city. So I don't like it, and you just have to sit here and not have equal representation. Bah. And I would almost respect that argument more than some of the galaxy brain stuff that we get, which are bad faith arguments, which are an attempt to actually argue against DC statehood on some other grounds. It gets to this really, really weird space. So with that, and rather than summarizing these arguments for you, I will let Representative Harris share these arguments, and then we'll break down sort of the major thrusts of what he's saying here and how they function as bad faith arguments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope America's watching what's going on the floor today, and they're paying careful attention to this debate. We hear speaker after speaker from the other side of the aisle say things like, it's been done before. The majority leader, clear precedent. Yeah, there's clear precedent. We know the person who was in the chair just before comes from the state that actually was the clear precedent in 1847 when retrocession occurred. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle say this isn't politics. This is about getting voting rights. This is about things like this. I would suggest that perhaps the people watching go to Wikipedia and see what the history is about the support for retrocession back to Maryland. You see, because, Mr. Speaker, this is not Congress's land. This is Maryland's land. Maryland gave it to the United States for the sole purpose of a permanent federal enclave. The nerve of hundreds of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle thinking it's their land, it's Maryland's land. And if you want voting rights, it's simple. Do exactly what occurred in 1847 and give the land back to Maryland. But whoa, wait a minute. That's not what this debate is about. Because retrocession has been proposed many times with no Democrat supporters. In fact, the majority leader was in Congress when these bills were proposed. If what he really wants is voting rights, he should have co-sponsored the bill because, Mr. Speaker, you know that if retrocession occurs, every single resident, except those ones in the White House, because of the amendment to the Constitution, they actually get 3 electoral votes under this proposed legislation. Every single one of those residents would have representation in Congress. And yes, Eleanor Holmes Norton could sit in Congress representing people from the state of Maryland. This is a pure political ploy. That's why none of my colleagues from Maryland are going to vote against this bill today. That's why none of my colleagues of Maryland have put in a retrocession bill. That's why all of my hundreds of colleagues across the aisle are going to pretend this is Congress's land. This is not. The Constitution is clear. If this land is given back to Maryland, Maryland has to accept. Well, the argument is Maryland doesn't want it back. That's interesting. I sat in the Maryland legislature with my colleague who's sitting across the aisle right now. If Marylanders are so concerned, or our representatives from Maryland are so concerned about getting voting rights, it's very simple. Go to their colleagues in the Maryland General Assembly, fully controlled by the Democrats, and say, let's take it back. Let's give those 700,000 people voting rights. Mr. Speaker, that's the correct approach. Don't steal this land from Maryland. I yield back.
Okay, so Representative Harris talks about retrocession into Maryland. So D.C., the part outside the federal core, would become part of Maryland. So Maryland gets this new city on its southwest. And this is a very funny argument to me. And if we look at it substantively, what would happen is really interesting because it imposes this burden on Maryland, which he says is run by Democrats, which is not quite true. They have a Republican governor, but it's basically saying, well, if Maryland wants to do this, you go out, you convince Maryland to do this. And, I would support that, but it's on you. You need to go get Maryland to do this thing. So this is moving the goalposts, right? I support your goal in theory, but I need you to go take these extra steps that I think are more constitutionally valid, even though you've already come up with a perfectly constitutional solution here. But second, it's assigning responsibility back to the person who wants change, right? And this is sort of a general progressive versus conservative divide with a lot of these debates. The progressive says, hey, I want to do a thing differently. And the conservative says, no, I like the status quo. But it's very hard sometimes, especially in a case like this, where the progressive has a very strong case for change, for the conservative to say, you know what, like, F you, I don't like you. That is not a valid argument, but something that sounds like a valid argument is to say, you know what, if you hopped over these 8 hurdles and jumped through these 3 other hoops, then, you might convince me that your fundamental right to equal representation under law is something that I should consider. So it's arguing over who's responsible for making the good argument. And this is also very funny to me because this is someone saying, well, Democrats should go do this. And it's like, you're a Republican representative from Maryland. Do you want retrocession? If you wanted retrocession, could you fight harder to make that happen? Where's your bill proposing that DC goes, or the part of DC with people in it goes back to Maryland? Where's your expenditure of political capital into retrocession if you actually think this is a good solution? And if you peel back a couple layers here, it's pretty easy to see why he's making this argument. And I think it's kind of funny that he tells people to go to Wikipedia, because if you go to the Wikipedia about retrocession, there's 2 polls. This is not a heavily polled issue, but there's 2 relevant polls about retrocession. And in 2000, George Washington University did a study. They found that 21% of people polled in the district supported retrocession. So 21% supported retrocession versus 86% who actually went to the polls and voted for statehood. So clearly an unpopular option for the people of DC. Additionally, a 2016 poll of Maryland residents found that only 28% supported annexing the District of Columbia, 44% were opposed. So if we take Harris at, not quite face value here, but if we actually imagine this happening, he's basically saying, you should go expend your political capital, your time, your energy, your resources on something that is extremely unpopular in both DC and Maryland. And if you succeed in making it popular, then I might consider going along with you. So that's a pretty classic bad faith argument, and obviously at a fundamental level, it violates this basic democratic principle of self-determination, right? The fact that DC residents have voted for statehood speaks very loudly here. The fact that Marylanders aren't really interested in adopting DC through retrocession, that's pretty important too. And of course, these 2 places have developed their own distinct political cultures. People from DC are like, yeah, I'm from DC. People from Maryland are like, yeah, I'm from Maryland. This might have been a great solution earlier in the country's history. It's obviously not a great solution now. And again, just to emphasize this, whenever somebody is saying you shouldn't do it this way, I think what you should really do is do it that way, and then they're not lifting a finger to help you do it the other way they say is better, they probably don't actually support doing it the other way. So it's important to recognize how that functions as a bad faith argument. The second point here, this one is really funny, and this gets to another fun constitutional quirk and something that is easily solvable within the context of this debate. So DC has a constitutional amendment that gives it 3 electoral votes. And if you look at that amendment, what it says is that Congress can direct how these electoral votes are distributed. So the solution here is pretty easy. DC, it becomes a state. DC gets as many electoral votes as all the other states are entitled to based on its population. And then what happens to these 3 extra electoral votes that are floating around in the Constitution? Well, Congress can direct them however they want. So Congress could pass a bill that says the winner of the popular vote gets these extra electoral votes. Or they could say the winner of the Electoral College gets these extra electoral votes. And it wouldn't even have an effect, therefore, on who the winner is. So it's another, relatively easy workaround. And unfortunately, again, one of these things we have to deal with because parties aren't represented in the Constitution. So that's the workaround. That's what the actual advocates of DC statehood say. And of course, none of the Republicans engaged with this point at all. And instead, they kept coming back to this argument of, you forgot about the people who live in the federal core. Who are those people? Well, they live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Traditionally, it's the president and his family. They're the only people who actually, quote, live, unquote, in the federal court. And this is a very funny and interesting problem that is dealt with directly in the bill. And again, this doesn't come up with this argument at all, right? They're not actually representing what's in the bill. The bill says anybody who gets caught living in the federal district, and again, like this is just the president and their family. That's who gets caught living in the federal district. Nobody is like camped out, setting up residence inside like a congressional building or the Security and Exchanges Commission building or whatever. No one's like camping out on a marble floor and setting that up as their permanent address somewhere, right? So we're really just talking about the president and their family. And traditionally, the president and their family, they don't even vote locally, right? Trump votes in Florida, absentee. The Obamas vote in Illinois. George Bush voted in Texas or whatever, right? That's just how this works. And this applies to the vice president and their family too, I guess. Although that's not necessarily in the federal core. Now there is like an interesting kind of sub-example here. One of the Obama kids was registered to vote at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So this bill would provide for people who were in that situation, and it literally might just be a kid of a president turning 18 while the president is in office. They could just register in their state of last residence. And the bill actually provides for that directly if you go ahead and you read the bill. So, the only other like really weird extenuating circumstance I could imagine here would be that you would just vote in the new state of Douglas Commonwealth. And you could set up like a voting location at your school or like, I don't know what. But anyway, this is a funny argument. It's a funny thought experiment. It's already dealt with in the bill. So this functions as a bad faith argument in two ways. First, it directly misrepresents what's in the bill, right? So what implicit message does that send? The implicit message is this is sloppy. They haven't thought this through. They actually have thought this through, right? There's no rush to judgment here. This is stuff that advocates and lawyers have been parsing for years and years and years. So there's an implicit argument there that's being made in bad faith. But then, I also find this argument really interesting because the argument for equal representation under law is so clear for DC statehood. So I think what this bad faith argument does is it sets up a ridiculous counterpoint. Sure, you're giving 700,000 people equal representation under law, but what you haven't accounted for is that you've now given even grosser power to an already extremely powerful person, the president of the United States. Now they'll get to control these 3 electoral votes all by themselves. You're the one, therefore, who is actually undemocratic. So it creates this kind of weird hypocrisy argument, but it invents a position for the DC statehood advocates to argue against, and is therefore, one, very funny, but then two, very much obviously in bad faith. And the last thing I find really funny about this, like say the bill didn't account for this and say it was only the president and their family who got to pick those 3 electoral votes. Like, what if the president had like 3 or 4 kids and they disagreed with each other about politics, and the 3 kids are like, oh, I hate mom and dad so much. I just hate them. And they voted against him. Man, you'd be in trouble. Like there'd be all this pressure to like get your kid to move out of the White House and go establish residency somewhere else. That would be hilarious. So I don't think that would be a particularly interesting, fictional political thriller. But if someone wanted to go ahead and write that, I'd give it a skim. That it would be funny to me personally as a satirical take on the Constitution. Okay. Last type of argument against DC statehood, and I'm gonna give Representative Harris a break. I'm gonna bring in Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Senator Tom Cotton, who famously argued to use troops to put down the BLM protests, which was really funny because we already had helicopters buzzing us in DC, which is not great. So we knew from experience that maybe federalizing the response to the protests was a really terrible idea that would cause violence against peaceful demonstrators. But Tom Cotton said when he was speaking out against DC statehood, quote, Wyoming is smaller than Washington by population, but it has 3 times as many workers in mining, logging, and construction, and 10 times as many workers in manufacturing. In other words, Wyoming is a well-rounded working class state. A new state of Washington would not be. This is dog whistle. Dog whistle is an obvious form of bad faith argumentation. He's absolutely hiding the ball with this statement, right? So let's look at this substantively, and then let's think about the ways in which it is very obviously implicitly racist. So do miners, loggers, and people who work in construction or manufacturing have more political rights than people who work in sales, education, nursing, medicine? I don't know what. Of course not, right? So this is already an argument that's in clear violation of equal representation under law. What he's doing here is he's playing around with associations, right? For his audience, for a lot of other audiences, even for a lot of Democrats, if you say, oh yeah, the well-rounded working class state, their picture is a white guy in a hard hat from like the 1960s or 70s, right? So he's playing around with that imagery, and he's trying to say that the hundreds of thousands of working class people here in DC somehow don't count. Why? Well, it's probably because they're blacker and browner than the working class voters in Wyoming. So it's trying to create this false divide between, his voters, his folks, and the folks here in D.C., all of whom are, equal under law, except the folks in D.C. don't have equal representation under law. So, some folks call this a dog whistle. I don't. I think the dog whistles just keep getting louder and louder. This is a giant racist klaxon sounding out from the Senate floor. But again, think about this from the perspective of how bad faith arguments function. He can't go out there and say a racism, right? That would get extreme admonishment. So the arguments are always one step removed, right? But the purpose is the same. It's othering these people in DC. It's saying, well, they would be worthy of equal representation under law if only they were doing more mining and more construction and logging. And come to my neighborhood, man. I'm looking at a construction site across the street here. Folks are working hard out in DC. And even if you have a cushy office job, you deserve equal representation under law too. Even if you're the highest falutin lobbyist on all of K Street, and you got a ritzy luxury condo or a beautiful townhome or whatever, you have as much of a right to vote as anybody else. You have as much of a right to vote as anybody else in any part of the country who's a qualified voter. That just is what it is. That's equal representation under law. But again, you can't argue against that directly. They don't want to do that. That's a value that's very hard to argue against. So it's this retreat to bad faith arguments. And I will also say it's such a silly argument on its face, and a lot of people fact checked it with here's what workers in the district actually look like. Here's all the jobs that they do, and how dare you say these aren't real jobs, yada yada yada. But it's just a silly argument. It's stupid, right? Like a logger is just as entitled to a vote as anybody else in any other industry. But we have this really spicy local Twitter account associated with our council, and it posts a lot about DC statehood. And they had a funny post that said, we do have loggers here in DC. We got lager beers. And it highlighted some of the products from our local breweries. And you know what? Those are actually local manufacturing jobs. And I think making beer is an extremely working class industry, if I've ever heard of one. We're probably at the point now where I think every state in the union has some craft brews going on. So maybe that's a good marker of deserving equal representation under the law. Is you got some lager beers, you got some pilsners, you got some good stuff for folks to quaff on a hot Friday afternoon. Maybe you can crack a beer after you go vote and you go exercise your fundamental rights. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. I think it's fun to dunk on these arguments. I think it's funny to take bad faith arguments at face value and actually examine them as if they were good faith arguments, because the contradictions just get so obvious so quickly. But it's that point underneath it that I really want to emphasize, right? The bad faith arguments satisfy psychological needs for the people making them, right? So they don't have to argue against the core values that are actually at stake in the debate. And it also just gives people an excuse to ignore the core value. That's what they're trying to do for their audience. They want to give the audience an excuse to say, yeah, you know what? I know that you guys have gone to all this trouble over the past couple decades with your DC statehood movement. You've had remarkable success, and we're voting on this bill today, but couldn't you just do retrocession? Couldn't you just build a time machine and go back in time 20 years and totally change your political strategy? That would be more convenient for me personally. Gosh, I really support what you're trying to do here, but could you just do a retrocession instead? It's no, we're not doing retrocession. That's not what people are debating. But that excuse making is very important in understanding how political communication works, right? if I want somebody to oppose something, it's very easy. I can just throw spaghetti at the wall, and they're going to find some excuse, and they're going to hold on to that little excuse and say not yet, or you're moving too fast, or you're not doing it right, or oh gosh, I'd support you, but only under such and such circumstances. And conversely, it's also important for understanding in the context of good faith arguments, excuses are also very important for going from opposition to support. Is there something that literally excuses you from an expected position of opposition to a novel position of support? And one of my favorite examples of this is Senator John Warner from Virginia. He's a Republican. He's been retired for a while. And he was one of the Republicans, this is probably about 10 or more years ago at this point, who was supportive of climate legislation. And he would go out there and he would give his spiel and talk about his conservative credentials. And then he would say, but who really convinced me to care about climate change was my grandchildren. They sat me down and said, Grandpa, we got to talk to you about climate change. This is really serious. And that's a great argument for a senator to make. It's a really great excuse, if you will, to not go along with the other folks in his party who were opposed to climate legislation at the time. And, that's also very hard to argue against because it's his grandkids, right? Are you going to go to a senator and say like, well, you know what? I think your grandkids are full of it, buddy. They haven't read this latest report from my favorite fossil fuel think tank. No, I mean, he's a senator. He's got a personal relationship with his grandchildren. He knows them better than you, and it's a deeply personal experience. So, when we think about how good faith persuasion actually works, it does convince people to change their positions, right? And importantly, it gives them a narrative that they can then take and share with people who might disagree with that position. And that gets them to a point where they can respectfully disagree with their colleagues, to use a senatorial term. But again, that's really important for understanding what those points of persuasion could actually look like in debates like this. I think that's harder with DC statehood because the political stakes are so high and the parties are so ground in. But again, I just wanted to underscore the sort of functions of these arguments beyond the substance of the arguments themselves. So I hope that was helpful. Bad faith arguments are a theme I am sure we will return to in the modern political communication era, because it is just so easy to talk past one another with these bad faith arguments and with these straw men. But it's really, really important for understanding the landscape. So with that, we'll be back in the next several days with some of our first interviews. I'm excited to share some perspectives other than mine and other than Representative Harris and Senator Cotton, who did not cooperate with the making of this episode, but I'm happy to hold up their views for robust scrutiny. All right, take it easy. Thanks.